So, very welcome to this presentation on the topic of audit fighting in corruption and the impact of perceived security levels in an organizational context. It's probably the longest title of any topic presented here over these 3 days, but I will try to make the presentation a little bit more interesting, or how shall I say, selling and sexy than the title. My name is Carlstedt. I'm out of Sweden, and I am here in 2 capacities. I am the distributor for PCB in the Nordics, but I also run a consulting company which is involved in GRC activities, including helping organizations implement internal control frameworks to also challenge, you could say, or contradict bribery and other issues within an organization, especially in an international context. Furthermore, I've been involved over the last 20 years in the involvement of a number of ISO standards. I am the editor of the current versions of 27002, 27005, and 27008. I'm also recently appointed the editor for the cybersecurity framework standard, which is under development and which will probably be listed as 27101, which will be in the market in 2 or 3 years, hopefully. So much for the introduction. Corruption then. I mean, corruption is not a local problem, it's not a national problem, it is an international problem, I would say. And it's something which every organization might theoretically suffer from in various instances, trying to be successful in business. This is a statement taken out of the China Journal of Accounting Research. It says that corruption is a chronic cancer that harms the transparency and accountability of government, and it's inevitably the target for audit institutions to dig out, fight against, and prevent from happening repeatedly. And I think that it's a fair statement. Corruption is what it is, and organizations have an ethical responsibility, I would say, to work against corruption the best way they can. And it's not something which is specific to China, it is the same problem all over the world. It just takes different forms in different cultures, I would say. What about corruption and fraud then? Well, typically, if you look at an organization over the years and historically, the main focus of the auditor and the main focus of implementing internal controls, if you compare the 2 aspects of corruption and fraud, has been more fraud-focused, essentially. How do we combat fraud? How do we make sure that directors or middle management or individuals do not perform fraudulent activities which are harmful to the company, the shareholders, stakeholders in general, and the public? Whereas corruption is not something entirely different, but it's a different type of problem, because as it states here, it typically takes place in the form of bribery, kickbacks, commissions, and other, in most cases, illegal transactions. The problem is that in many cases, there are historical examples of the opposite, but in many cases, it typically don't leave any trace in official records. Or people involved in these type of activities go through great lengths to make sure that this is not the case. In many cases where you have had big corruption scandals, it's because what? Well, auditors or governments have been able to trace the transactions. If you cannot trace the transactions, what do you do from an internal control perspective? The UN did a study, and some of the material in this presentation is from that study about 10 years ago on this. Another interesting factor, if we compare this with ISO standards, is that OECD, about 20 years ago, came to the conclusion that in many areas of the world, you have what you would like to call, in general terms, weak government. Legislation is weak, essentially, and the follow-up by monitoring authorities vis-à-vis current legislation is weak. So the suggested approach by OECD, even back then, was to ensure for companies involved in international activities in these areas to focus on governance, because their view was that with a strong governance perspective and a strong governance scheme implemented, that would help international organizations working in a context where you have weak government to combat corruption and fraud locally as part of a corporate approach, essentially. Moreover, again in China, they have made the discovery, and I mean this is not rocket science, looking at businesses and government entities where they have a high number of what they call irregularities. This also mirrors in their thinking, based upon their assessment of the outcome of the analysis they've made. This mirrors also a higher level of corruption and fraudulent activities. What does this tell us as auditors? Well, it tells us that if you can work with, how shall I say, minimizing irregularities, it might also theoretically help you decrease fraudulent and corruption or corrupt activities within an organization or a government authority. And it also, as it says here, states that it has an impact on what happens after the audit, so to speak. So generally speaking, the stronger the framework you have in place, the better internal control you have in place, the less irregularities, the easier to monitor the situation in general and to detect something which could possibly be a fraudulent or corrupt activity in a specific context. It also clearly indicates that auditing activities as such, even if they're not aimed at fighting corruption, also tends to curb corruption. Why? Well, if you plan to conduct corrupt activities, for example, it means that you have to be more careful. It's very basic. With audit comes control. With control, you need to be more careful, which means that corruption is not as easy anymore. On the other hand, as it states here, generally speaking, auditors, we're not experts when it comes to detecting corruption in general terms. It's not what we're typically looking for. But we can be, and even government auditing can be, by being intensified and by making the results known to the public, especially if they include possible findings of corruption, have a positive effect on the situation in general terms. And again, this is also a statement from this Chinese study. Their view, and I concur essentially, is that auditing in general terms can help organizations combat corruption, even on a government level. And I mean, we're all aware of, and this is just one example, of the negative effects of corruption in general terms. Now, generally speaking, the expectations with the stakeholders, regardless if it's the board or if it's the public, is that, well, auditors, they should, be engaged or have a positive effect when it comes to combating auditing, or combating corruption. But do we really? I mean, typically we, as it states here, we focus on typical types of evidence. is this the evidence we need to be able to say that here we have a corrupt activity? And in many cases, auditors feel that it's not my job. If I see something, I will report it, but how do I actively work detecting corruption? What steps do I need to take building an audit plan to include the possibility of corruption, for example? So what is really the role of auditors when it comes to fighting corruption? It could also be the case that you clearly detect it. You have the distinct feeling that there is something rotten here, but based upon the time I have, the audit plan I'm working within, the context in general, it's not possible to detect it. And it's also the case many times that they don't have the experience or the toolkit to be able to address this. And this is more or less what I said before. I mean, if a bribe goes from one hand to another as an auditor, how do you detect that 6 months later? And I mean, auditors still, and this is maybe the case many times because the people involved in corruption are sometimes stupid. People who also commit fraudulent activities are sometimes stupid, especially if they commit an act of this nature over a long period of time and it's not detected. We have had instances in Sweden, not going into detail, for example, where after many years it was detected that high-level officials within a municipality, whenever there was a contract for, let's say, maybe not a new road, but for housing or whatever, there was a kickback made by the construction company, for example, to specific individuals. And it was made in open sight. Why? Because it was part of a culture. It was almost accepted within the organization. Everybody got their share. Who cared? And still, even with the best of systems, even with the best internal control framework, even with the most stringent legislation, does that isolate and kill the idea of corruption? I don't think it does, unfortunately. But it can help organizations combat corruption in a more effective and efficient way. Corruption audit then, well, what is that about? I mean, can you actually audit to discover corruption? Well, the auditors, as I mentioned now a few times, may identify, as it states here, cases of potential corruption, but it may also require different skills. Auditing and investigation is not always the same thing, but an auditor detecting possible cases of corruption is a source of information. So it's not necessarily the case that the auditor is, how shall I say, the final instance of proving a case of corruption, but it could very well be the first step in a long chain of investigations, eventually proving that we have a case of corruption. So the role of the auditor is very important because audit, as I stated before, in my view, is something which makes life for corrupt individuals and people committing corrupt activities and fraudulent activities more difficult. But it's also a source of information to the relevant authorities and to the relevant internal authorities when it comes to corruption cases. So many times the role might not be playing the detective, so to speak, but being the whistleblower, essentially. Sorry? The informant. Exactly. And in most, I shouldn't say in most, but in most Scandinavian cases or in countries, it is actually required by law, as being an auditor, to report fraudulent and corrupt activities to the relevant authorities. Now, this is not the case globally maybe, but you could apply the same general posture when it comes to, for example, internal audit, because internal audit is just as important as external and financial audit when it comes to this. I would say that if you look at the general approach, maybe internal audit in the general context of an organization in a global perspective is even more important. And I'll explain why later on. But generally speaking, internal audit is there all the time. Internal audit helps top management enforce the internal control framework. And the internal control framework, if applied effectively, will at least have a positive effect when it comes to, in general terms, combating audit within an organization or within an organizational context.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Now, when you say auditor, you're relating to the state auditor?
I'm relating to an auditor. I'm relating to auditors in general terms. So it could be a state auditor in the context of their job. It could be a financial auditor doing third-party audits of companies. It could be an internal auditor. I think that these, how shall I say, approaches in general terms are applicable regardless if we're talking about a third-party auditor or a state auditor. But my point, and that's what I'm trying to say right now, is that out of all these types of auditors, I think that we tend to sometimes neglect the importance of the internal auditor when it comes to this. Even maybe the internal auditor within a management system context, because what we're looking for here is essentially looking at how do we work. And I will try to explain this later on, because there are a few, what's the English term, tells or signals which might give the organization wind of or signal the possibility of corruption or corrupt activities, so to speak, or fraudulent activities, if you so will. So I'll come back to this, but my general point of view is that from the legislator's perspective, of course, state or national auditors, third-party auditors in the capacity of financial auditors, of course, they have their role to play, but on an ongoing basis, internal audit is, to me, the key, because the internal control framework you apply is the key for management within an organization trying to combat these types of activities. Because there are not that many tools in the toolbox for top management to apply if they want to take on responsibility for, and it is their responsibility in my book, to combat audit within their scope of responsibilities, so to speak. But it's a very good question. But generally speaking, so far what I've said applies to audit in general. But we're now moving into a more practical perspective. So I'm not stating that what I'm saying for now on does not apply to other auditors, but it's more of an internal audit focus. Thank you for the clarifying question. Yes, so because it's also the case that internal auditors should have a better understanding of the organization. And to be able to detect corruption, you need to understand the organization, not just audit it. You need to understand the processes, you need to understand the thinking, you need to understand what's the normal approach and what is an irregularity, for example. It's also the case that, I mean, as an external auditor, what do you look at? Well, you look at the financial figures, for example, and you look at the output from the relevant systems. But from an internal audit perspective, if you know your company, you know what constitutes an irregularity. This is typically tougher for a financial auditor, especially given, at least in my jurisdiction, the number of days they have typically to conduct the financial audit in general terms. Oh, sorry. Yes. So, working as an internal auditor, when you do the planning, I think that it should be considered good practice, maybe not best practice, but good practice to consider the risk of or possibility of corruption within the organization. It poses a threat, a risk to the organization, so you should make this part of your planning. And you could also include it in the audit plan, for example, by getting a general brief in there about the approach, for example, to assess the opportunities for corruption in the organization. And this can, of course, depending on ways of working, be phrased in many different ways. It could also be part of the audit charter for internal audit. And many organizations, I have not talked about 37001, but generally speaking, at least from a Western European perspective, which is my market in general terms, most organizations over a specific size have a posture which says that we take active stand against bribery. So, of course, you should do it within your context as well. And I mean, making sure that internal audit encompasses these aspects is one way of doing this.
In our jurisdiction in the Americas, it's criminal activity to begin with.
Yes?
The financial industry.
Yes? 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 And what I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to present an approach which allows for an organization to or for the internal audit, for example, within an organization to how shall I say, address aspects of corruption, for example. Because corruption audit, what is that? I mean, it could be an integrated part of the internal audit. It could also be a specific audit activity conducted by internal audit, for example, or another instance. But generally speaking, looking into the topic, you have some, how shall I say, general activities which apply, typically like knowing the audit entity, developing the audit criteria, and so on and so forth. But what I've how shall I say, I shouldn't say discovered, but come across is an approach which includes looking at what we call corruption opportunities and trying to apply this in what you could call a test plan, essentially. So it means that you can also show, as an auditor, you have an approach, and you can also show what you do, and it's also something which, in a structured manner, possibly will help you to investigate or to audit, I should say rather, these aspects in a good way. So what you do essentially is interviewing the key personnel, and then you develop audit criteria. And you look at what we call corruption opportunities. So we essentially look at the business, and you look at what risks, what scenarios would allow for corruption within the organization, for example. Are we going into a new field of business? Are we changing processes? What does our procurement process look like, for example? And this has to be based upon, if we go back, of course, knowing the entity you're auditing or knowing the context. So it's really tough to do something like this with a limited, how shall I say, knowledge of the scope of the audit. But if you know the scope, you could possibly build a number of scenarios you could use and essentially list, as it states here, an inventory of corruption opportunities. It doesn't mean that you say that this and this and this activity automatically means that we have corruption here in play, so to speak, but it means that You identify scenarios and areas where the risk for corruption is greater, essentially. It helps you to determine materiality and criticality when it comes to corruption, essentially. And building such a list in this context then would be building an inventory of corruption opportunities. And of course this will look very different depending on the scope of the audit and what type of industry you're in and so on and so forth. But it will help you in a structured way to assess the risk of corruption and to build an audit plan to address that. So the next step then is to look at this from a testing perspective. What does test mean? Well, it's not as technical as it might seem. Essentially, it's about, assessing, based upon the scenarios you have built, what is the likelihood here? We have, for example, derived 10 or 20 possible scenarios. What you do as a next step then is trying to determine what's the possibility, what's the likelihood here? And you can use different sources of input. And if we go back to what I mentioned before, if you, for example, have, how shall I say, a number of areas where you've detected irregularities, if you combine irregularities with possible opportunities for corruption, it means that you can get even closer to possibly detecting activities related to corruption within the organization. So again, it's about knowing the organization and putting two and two together, so to speak. And you need then, of course, to assess this and also to identify the relevant functions or operational areas where the risks are the greatest in general. Because as with any other type of audit, in my book, you should focus upon the critical areas. Where do you see the highest risks, so to speak? Now, you can also look for, when you do this, indicators, so to speak. And indicators could be, for example, and we'll talk more about that later, something which shows that we are extremely inefficient or ineffective here. And you should ask yourself, why? Typical examples of this are, for example, paying too much for specific services. I mean, it's a school book example, but it still applies. If you know the organization, you know what is the typical price for this service, or what is the typical sum being transferred to this supplier for this specific services for a specific period of time. If there is something there which presents an irregularity, it could also mean that you have identified an indicator for corruption as well. So, this is also important, of course. And you need also to look at what's the probability that it's possible to bypass the applied internal controls. And here we have the link with what I phrased or what I stated in the beginning, the perceived level of control, so to speak. The problem in many companies is that they do things by the book. I'm not stating that it's a problem to do things by the book, but the problem is when you do things by the book that you stop considering whether doing things by the book is an efficient approach and an effective approach or not. So you should always also address the element of risk, for example, and other aspects relevant to be able to gauge the effectiveness of the controls you have in place. So in theory, for example, you might here in this instance come to a conclusion that of course we have the internal controls in place, but oops, considering that what we're doing has shifted in nature or whatever over the last few years, or there is new technology, or there is a new solution in place, it means that bypassing this rigid framework we have is much easier now than 3 years ago, or new technology allows for bypassing the controls we have in place. So this is also something you need to take into consideration. And one way of doing this is, of course, then, as it states here, to interview management, but also operational management, of course, to identify these areas. And also to look at what are we actually doing, interviewing staff and selected users of goods, for example, or services. So you need to stay in tune with the business. It also, of course, means that you need to go to another level of depth, perhaps, than you do many times, and actually interviewing the lower level of staff representatives to see what's actually going on. And then go back to the initial assessment to look at what we're facing. And I'm not a huge fan of checklists, etc., but using a structured approach will also help you prove that you've actually approached this matter in a structured way and that you have an approach for audit which covers these aspects in general terms. And it will, of course, add also to the quality of the activities you're performing. And also, generally speaking, if we talk at what's sometimes called performance audits, this can also help detect this because, as I stated before, if you identify an area where, for example, you have diseconomy, inefficiency, failure to achieve results, you should ask yourself, why? And I mean, generally speaking, these are clear indicators of, in many cases, a possible risk of corruption, for example, especially if it is on an ongoing basis or in a specific geography or related to specific individuals within the organization, for example. So this is also something which supports your planning, supports your focus, and so on and so forth for conducting these activities. Could also be the case that you're failing or you have essentially a lack of economy. Could also be that the, as it states here, accountability mechanism for exceeding the budget is weak, which means that, again, also looking at it from a governance perspective, weak, how shall I say, a weak approach to accountability is also something which in general terms presents a risk when it comes to corruption and fighting corruption. But it's also a lack of control or an ineffective control approach, I would say. So this is also something which would allow for you to identify an area of risk when it comes to these aspects. And we have some other examples here. These are other examples. So performance audits identifying areas such as this. For example, expenditure on maintenance is disproportionately high soon after completion of the project, or regular maintenance is neglected, and infrastructure is allowed to deteriorate while new projects are planned. I've seen this working. I won't mention against what region or geography, but in specific geographies I've seen this time and time again. Why? Well, because there is no interest in maintenance. Why? Because new investment allows for what? Another corrupt transaction. Of course, maintenance might also allow for this, but if you have a situation where international resources pours money into a certain geography and that money is funneled through certain, how shall I say, filters or by a specific approach, it means that I wouldn't say that it's a given, but it increases again the risk for, especially in a society where you have corruption for this to happen again and again. You could also see again, and this is also interesting from a management perspective or management system perspective, poor measurement and a poor approach when it comes to looking at goals and objectives and actually having tangible results, allowing for a comparison with, how shall I say, current status against the set goals, is also something which allows for a greater risk for corruption. And the absence of this also, of course, means that it's harder to detect. So performance auditing, generally speaking, has an important role, being part of a preventive approach, you could say. And it's especially important then that top management or governing bodies take an active role. The continuous support of top management for audit, including internal audit, including performance audit or whatever, is key to successfully addressing this in my book. And we'll look at more examples further on. But I think that doing this is important. And I'm not stating that compliance audit is not important, but the continuous activity, ongoing activity of an audit nature, so to speak, is important. And again, also making sure that the responsible people know that what you're doing will be subject to audit as a general way of working. And again, also set relevant criteria for this and make sure that managers are aware of the criteria set out for the audits. So, to, I think, more or less wrap it up, success factors. When you try to combat corruption, you need to use a number of angles. Of course, regulations are important, but regulations, and maybe I'm overstating this, but if you have an organization where top management do not push their own weight in their capacity in this area, regulations only go so far. Because if you do not have the continuous support from top management, do not have an effective internal control system, do not run performance audits, do not know your organization, do not have a good scheme for governance, generally speaking, within the organization, where do you stand? You don't know. Code of conduct for employees and vendors, of course. But it's also important that this applies to all, also top management. Awareness-raising campaigns. And I think that one of the most important awareness-raising campaigns you can conduct is, guess what? Audit. Audit is also awareness-raising within the organization. Training of staff and so on. Internal controls, sanctions and incentives, of course. But it's also a matter of, and this is also tough sometimes, making sure that it's known within the organization how to internally address a suspected case of corruption or fraudulent activities. Where do I report? Who do I talk to? What happens to me if I report on this topic? Which then brings us to the next step, protection of whistleblowers. Of course this is important. The importance might of course vary depending on the nature of what's being reported and so on and so forth, but it's extremely important. And again then, as I stated, audit, it's only one aspect of this, but it's important. And I think that it's important that you nail down what do you aim to achieve with audit when it comes to fighting corruption within the organization. and you also nail down, or rather make sure that you know, what level are we at when it comes to our internal control frameworks and the controls we have in place. Only under those circumstances will audit on an ongoing basis effectively help the organization combat corruption.